Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. This week is just the gift that keeps on giving when it comes to new processor stuff. Definitely, like I probably should have expected it, given that we are in Techtober in a way, not the smartphone Techtober, Techtember, but a lot of chip announcements is what is happening right now. So yesterday we covered MediaTek's Dimensity 9400, which is obviously very interesting to us in the Apple community and how it compares to Apple's A18, A18 Pro, things like that, previous generation processors, what it means for the next wave of Android flagships, a lot of interesting stuff. However, we are apparently not even close to done yet because I don't want to say out of the blue, except for the joke that Intel is blue, of course. Intel announced officially Arrow Lake desktop chips. That is, of course, in contrast to their mobile Lunar Lake that they have thus far, well, not just revealed, of course, but even launched. And we reacted to some very early reviews of Lunar Lake. I'm still waiting for some bug fixes and some more comprehensive reviews to line up in that regard. And then we'll hopefully keep on covering that and how it compares to Zen 5 after bug fixes and driver fixes. Zen 5 has really been a very, very messy launch. Yeah, but now apparently Intel is in the game and saying, look, our last few desktop chips were like 300-watt behemoths. Like, they really weren't that consumer friendly. It was a pain in the ass to cool them and stuff like that. So here's a new generation. It's built on a combination of Intel of TSMC N3B and 5P and 6. So this is like the first Intel chip that is basically Intel only in design, like no note stuff from Intel as far as I know. I don't know if the base tile might be Intel, but basically all the stuff that truly defines performance is TSMC. And given that, of course, we have other TSMC chips now, and the N3 node, N3B, N3E, of course, a lot from Apple, but now the Dimensity 9400, soon the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4. This is going to be a very, very comprehensive list, and I keep mentioning it in my last couple of streams, that is, by the end of the year, I want to create a really large, nice spreadsheet with the latest Apple chips, the latest major competitors for mobile, Dimensity 9400, Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, and their latest desktop comparisons. Of course, as Apple launches not just the M4 Max, but also Max based on M4 Pro and M4 Max variants. So there's a lot of data that we are accumulating. We're close to the 200th video here on this channel. So yeah, a lot of stuff is happening. October is very, very busy. Alizera Dictator joining the chat saying hello, hello. Angelica, one of our YouTube channel members, joining, wishing us all a nice stream, and that we have a very nice intellectual meeting. Well, that sounds pretty interesting. Let's see how that works. I am using Gamers Nexus here because I could be just reading out from a website or something like that, and it probably would still work, but I think if we just let them run at like 1.25, we'll get through it relatively quickly. This will not be like a 2-hour plus stream, and as always, it will give you guys the option to chime in, give me your opinions, your questions, and for us just to figure out what the hell is going on now that we are basically almost complete when it comes to this new generation of chips. We got Zen 5. Now we're getting Lion Cove cores across Intel's mobile and desktop chips. Of course, Apple will soon have their latest ARM v9 cores on Macs as well, and create much bigger dies than just the base M4 for it. Of course, Dimensity 9400, we reacted to that yesterday. There have been some interesting rumors about the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 saying that it might consume 20 watts at peak, which definitely would be very interesting, and I would definitely love to see that, in the sense that I would love to react to that. It wouldn't be good, obviously, but that's an interesting data point. Yeah, so that's about it. What you can expect from me in the next coming weeks and months as we get reviews for all of that, as we get bug fixes and refinements and apps and games that specifically are designed for the new architectures. Of course, sometime early next year, we're also getting RTX 5000. So while this is a very Apple-centric channel, and I know most of you will probably care much more about something like the Dimensity 9400 than Intel's Arrow Lake, it's still something I would like to cover. It's still data I would like to accumulate and just work with you together through it. That being said, there is a couple of Apple-only stuff that I would like to still mention. First is a very, very reasonable rumor, which is we, of course, know that the iPhone 16 and 16 Plus have the new battery replacement mechanism that is connected with a low voltage electrical current or loosened by it for that matter. And iFixit has even released like a $10 tool that works with USB-C. So that's now very easy to do yourself. There is, of course, like also like the metal chassis battery on the iPhone 16 Pro, but not the 16 Pro Max. And for a while, we kind of thought that basically the iPhone 17 generation would combine all these new technologies. So metal chassis battery for all devices, that hasn't yet been confirmed. But what seemingly is getting confirmed is that all devices will be getting the new battery electric adhesion method that is easy to connect and disconnect by just attaching like a 9-volt like current to it. So while this rumor isn't anything crazy, I just thought it might make sense mentioning it. I know, of course, talking about iPhone 17 when iPhone 16 is like barely a month old is like very premature in many ways, but this one just makes sense because it just builds on tech that we got in prior generations. It unifies stuff, makes all iPhones like follow the same like repair scheme. I think this rumor will probably turn out true. And if I were to bet money on it, I would also argue that if Apple's testing for the metal chassis battery turns out that, oh yeah, it's actually pretty good as well, then we will see a similar battery on all iPhone 17s or at least all iPhone 17 Pro models, not just the smaller variant. Yeah, that's for the iPhone. There is more stuff. I know that Max Tech has done a full video on extra performance stuff from like the leaked M4 devices in Russia. This is one piece of data that I thought would be very interesting to cover. It shows that, and this is their calculation, usually I do the stuff at the top of my head, and that is that the M4 MacBook Pro delivers almost 60%, 57% to be precise, higher performance from its neural engine. That's for the quantized score, so that's integer 8. This is similar to the uplift, but actually even more significant than what we have seen from the A17 Pro to the A18 Pro, where we see around a 50% uplift. And this, of course, despite Apple still claiming the same number of tops. So I wouldn't actually be surprised if M4, like on Mac, might even still have basically the same number of tops. Well, not as the M3, of course, because the M3 had differently calculated top still, but like then the M4 on the iPad Pro, because we know that the iPad Pro delivers you around 10% less performance. Maybe it's an overclocked chip. Maybe it would result in like over 40 tops officially based on Apple's calculations. But Apple has really been weird in how they exactly give us tops numbers. So we sometimes see huge uplifts in performance, but they don't really correspond with similar uplift in tops count. So at that point, I'm just more inclined to see how do AI benchmarks fare, and more importantly, down the road, how does Apple Intelligence perform, of course, on Apple devices. Maybe there will be some good benchmark out of that. I don't know. But yeah, for now, definitely some very promising results here, and something that I would love to see really well compared. I've given even like almost like a task to Vadim from MaxTech, and I said, look guys, you have so many devices like across now Zen 5 and probably soon like well, I believe no, they also have Lunar Lake. Of course they have. We watched one of their Lunar Lake reviews, and I just said, look, it would be amazing once Dimensity 9400 is officially out, once Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 is officially out. Could you please just run the latest version of Geekbench AI on all of them, and hopefully like 2 or 3 times so that the average makes sense? Sometimes these results are pretty unstable for some reason, because it's just so complicated to compare that. Like Geekbench AI 1.1 gives like very different results from 1.0. So whenever people like try to use data that is 2-3 months old, that makes zero sense, unfortunately. And then like sometimes like a new OS version might improve it. Like iOS 18 did improve AI performance on the A17 Pro during the beta period. Again, not saying that, oh, Apple needs to win, this is why I want to run all these benchmarks, but I'm actually really genuinely curious how all of these AI stuff will compare down the road. Of course, the most important stuff about it will actually be what kind of tasks does your device actually run when it comes to AI, because even if one might say, oh, ChatGPT is so much better than like Apple Intelligence, well, if most of ChatGPT then still runs in the cloud, then your AI hardware in your device basically doesn't matter at this point. Whether we are talking like a powerful neural processing unit or just a very powerful GPU, doesn't matter if the task isn't really optimized for offline use. So that will be interesting. Of course, with Apple, there also will be interesting to see, is there a big difference between like 8 gig Max and 16 gig Max, now that they're targeting M4 MacBooks with 16 gigabyte of base memory rather than 8. Maybe Apple just sees a lot of demand for memory in their AI tasks, or maybe they just don't want to fall behind Windows competitors who now often offer like 24 or 32 gigabyte configurations at price points where Apple still offers 8. Yeah, but that's about it. There's nothing crazy right now. Obviously, we have been doing such regular live streams that it's kind of difficult to find news every day. This is why I'm even surprised that I'm streaming today. I'm probably not streaming on the weekend for the reason that I'll probably want to have some time off. But with all these days giving us some surprise stuff, yeah, I just really didn't want to let you guys hanging. Yeah, but that's about it for the Apple stuff of this Apple presentation, of this Apple focused podcast, I guess. We've been streaming now for almost 15 minutes, so I feel comfortable giving you the usual shout out to do the YouTube jazz, subscribing to the channel, liking the video, sharing it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it, and of course commenting. I love me a lively live chat. I love interacting with you guys, answering your questions, having little debates, learning of new people joining our community. That's fantastic. And whenever you catch me live and you want to support this channel directly, consider leaving a small donation in the form of a super chat or a super sticker, or consider becoming a channel member. Shout out to Angelica and Max Maximus, who are MarkTech Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube, or you can become a supporter over on Patreon. Yeah, like again, I've been using more Twitter for this stuff recently, because unfortunately, like the more serious websites have been a little slower in aggregating certain data points. But yeah, shout out to the likes of Vadim Yurev from MaxTech for sharing data. Obviously, this is some kind of exclusive for them. You see all the watermarks here, and I just didn't see a reason to react to the entire video when we've already covered even some results in yesterday's stream. Yeah, Without further ado, of course, now that I've introduced myself and introduced the topics of today, I would like to go through the Gamers Nexus breakdown of Intel Arrow Lake together with you guys, just see how it all works for us. Because to me, I really trust Gamers Nexus. I also trust Hardware Unboxed. They also have a similar video like that up today. But usually, whenever Gamers Nexus does a somewhat short video, which for them 22 minutes, believe it or not, is relatively short, I do prefer to go with them. And there's some good insights here, some good like architectural breakdowns, and of course we'll see what it results in. And unlike some channels, some PC focused channels, Gamers Nexus really doesn't tend to do any kind of like artificial boosting. Like they don't like declare something the undisputed winner like months in advance. They really focus on the importance of proper testing, which I mean, it does benefit them, of course, since they are the ones doing the testing, but they are definitely not fanboys. They, of course, are not fans of Apple by any means, but that's to be expected by most PC-focused channels. I guess the only ones that really do a lot of like Apple stuff, like comparatively a lot, would be Hardware Canucks. And of course, Linus Tech Tips does a little bit of everything, but that doesn't mean that everything he does is even remotely good, of course. So let's get started.
Intel today officially announced its Core Ultra 200S series of CPUs. We're going to go over the specs, the pricing, all that stuff today.
Okay. 1.25 is once again way too fast. So we are going to go with a manual 1.15, which has served us pretty well thus far.
This is replacing the lineup of i3, i5, i7, i9 with Ultra 200 for the naming, and then the S stands for desktop.
Yeah,
like it always has.
The branding, this is something that, of course, I have commented on when it comes to AMD plenty. Oh my God, the branding of all these chips has gotten so ridiculous. Like Apple, like you can criticize Apple for a lot, but Apple is at like A18 at this point. They didn't feel the need to like randomly change letters and numbers somewhere in between from A4 to A18. They changed like the branding from Bionic to Pro at this point, but that's a rather small rebrand that actually doesn't, like most consumers wouldn't even be really aware of. Of course, when it comes to their like more powerful chips, they had like AX chips. Now that they or AZ chips even for a bit, but those then became just M series. And from that we had M1, M2, M3, M4, and with those chips we had Pro, Max, and Ultra variants. We can argue maybe that Max and Ultra should have been like changed in terms of like which one is which. And maybe Pro is a little confusing because we do have MacBook Pros, but not every device that has an M4, like an M Pro chip, is also Pro named, because we now also have like Mac Minis that have Pro chips. So it can be confusing if you really hyper focus and nitpick, but it's nowhere near to like Intel Core Ultra 200S series.
New CPUs will launch on October 24th. They'll cost between $294 and $590, with the official retailer pricing potentially a little higher than this.
Yeah, that's usually the case. Those are mass order prices.
The SKUs formally announced today and relevant.
Yeah, this is where, of course, this is why I didn't want to go to a website, because obviously they will, I think that Gamers Nexus will do a better job of explaining stuff than I do. Some very important quick summaries from here that you might be able to see, or you might even like know, guessing from like what we had on Lunar Lake already, is the fact that we are losing multi-threading. So in comparison to last gen, so we only have as many threads as we do have cores. We do have technically a frequency reduction down to 5.7 gigahertz, with like depending if you choose the 14900K or the 14900KS. Previously, the top speeds would have been like 6 or even 6.2 gigahertz. So that's a regression. definitely, like, and you could see like, oh, they're changing a lot of the architecture, right? If you're getting rid of hyperthreading, if you're even willing to reduce clock speeds, what are you getting in return? And I think this is a story worth telling, because I think there's a lot of like Apple like thinking, or you could even just argue ARM like thinking here, to go with like wider cores, like slow and wide rather than fast and small. And we obviously, previous Intel cores haven't been small by any measures, but these ones, especially for the lack of hyperthreading, are really big cores, and the efficiency cores are pretty big in comparison to other efficiency cores. So it's a very, very interesting generation. And Relay joining the chat. Hello. There is also now the inclusion of NPU stuff. This is by no means their fastest NPU stuff, of course, with like Lunar Lake delivering like what was it, 45, 50, and this is 13 tops. So whatever they have in here is definitely not the highest end.
To our audience include 5, ranging from the Ultra 5 through the Ultra 9 series. We'll get into some basic architectural information today, plus some core product details. Now, Intel really heavily leaned on power efficiency, reduction in power consumption, as a result, reduction in temperature of the CPUs, and then also said that more or less the Core Ultra 9 285K, get used to that, is on par with the 14900K. So
so that is, and they already give us those little glimpses of the I think most infamous slide from this presentation by Intel, which basically focuses on, we are not really faster than last gen, maybe in multi-threading tasks in some ways, but like definitely not in gaming. In fact, there is like even a regression. So what are Intel's arguments here? Why can they justify launching a generation that might be in some ways slower than the previous one?
There's some things here that feel familiar to Zen 5.
Of course, that happens now in the backdrop of like I remember when like Intel was hitting like 5.8 gigahertz on like the 3900K and something like that. And I was like, oh, and Apple was at that point like at 4 gigahertz max, more like 3.7 and something like that. Even with the M5 generation, right? 3.5, 3.7 at max. And I was like, oh yeah, so there is a big difference to what kind of clock speeds you can really target between x86 and ARM. And like what I guess I didn't understand is that, of course, Intel is able to target like diminishing returns, because this is a desktop chip that will be actively cooled. It will be paired with very beefy cooling in comparison to anything that Apple offers outside of the Mac Pro. Even the Mac Studio won't have quite the same amount of cooling that many people will be putting on the 285K. But what now, of course, stands out, now Apple is at 4.4 gigahertz with the M4, but Intel now has almost regressed to 5.7 at max. And in fact, their lower tiers go to like 5.3 or something like that. So that to me just basically screams that whether we are talking ARM or x86, if you want a chip with a very, very nice big IPC, instructions per clock rate, if you want a chip that is like reasonably efficient, you really cannot target completely ridiculous clock speeds. So whatever people were saying over like in the early days of ARM, that like, oh look, like not only is like x86 higher IPC, but it's like clocked several gigahertz higher. Then of course IPC became higher on ARM, but the clock speeds were still like 2 gigahertz higher on so like 50% or so higher on x86. And now the gap in clock speeds is slower than ever. But Intel hasn't really overcome now that IPC loss that they have had versus ARM for quite a few years. So it just seems that Apple has done such a good job, and now I would argue the X925 core from ARM is following a little bit of that. Like they've done such a good job with RISC. I really don't know if Intel can like I guess recover is the wrong word, because I know that Risk will probably not win on Windows, simply because Windows is an OS that people like to use like ancient software on at this point. And you can even see how much baggage there is on like the driver level and even like the hardware design level for processors and graphics cards, just to ensure that long as backwards compatibility that of course Apple doesn't quite care as much about. Yeah, and like it's just insane just how much cleaner the approach is now on ARM devices.
Intel saying that this is a foundational piece that puts a lot of less visible or less flashy changes in place for future designs, just like AMD was saying about Zen 5. And performance for gaming might not look much better on a chart, so prepare for that. But they are saying that the efficiency improvements are pretty large. So sounds like we're going to have a lot to test coming up. And for our testing, we're actually rerunning everything right now with the 2H24 Windows update and with all the BIOS updates that contain for AMD AGESA changes and for Intel microcode changes. So all that's getting tested right now.
This year has really been a mess when it comes to releases. Windows releases, driver releases, Zen 5, the entire release in general. And now we had to wait until like Windows, like what is it called, 2H24 or H224, whatever. And there were like other fixes also, even for older Windows releases. We saw some massive performance gains, even down to Zen 3. So it seems like there was a lot of performance left on the table for literally 4 years or more with the chips that AMD has been launching. And you can argue which one is more to blame here, Windows or Microsoft or AMD at this point. Doesn't really matter, I guess, from a consumer perspective. This is why this year has really been so crazy. Like, usually I would watch one video that was like, oh, here's Zen 5 and here's how it performs. And I would be like, oh, and here's Apple, because obviously I know Apple, we care about Apple. And I would be like, oh, this is what that means and this is what it could mean for the next generation. And then Apple's next generation comes out and I can almost basically reuse the data that is at this point 3-4 months old from like an initial AMD or Intel review and say like, oh, look, here is how much faster Apple is, or slower or more efficient. Now I cannot do that. Now by the time M4 comes out, I have to hope that there are new, more comprehensive Zen 5 benchmarks on the latest Windows release, the latest drivers. Hopefully some of the newer games get even updated. The same goes for Error Lake. It's really maddening in so many ways.
For that, this video is brought to you by the Fractal North and Fractal North XL cases. These cases brought wood front panel accents to the market while still maintaining relatively high airflow and good thermal performance.
I don't like the designs. I like the
has optional all mesh or glass
I like
side
the
panels,
wood in the front, but everything else about
They
it.
also have color matched accents between the white and black cases, with the wood likewise matched for the theme. Learn more at the links in the description below. All right, we don't want to waste anyone's time today, so we're going to get straight into the core details of the products, and then we'll cover some of Intel's more technical announcements and discussion points. First of all, Intel is leading the Arrow Lake launch with the case
I'm not commenting too much on pricing here because, in my opinion, like actual retail prices, for one, are going to be higher than the mass order prices that you see here. So somewhere, I would argue, in the 650 range, probably for the highest end part. And while the rest will probably be, not only better value, but might have like smaller increases in pricing, like where I see 379, I don't really see 430 as the end consumer price, but maybe like 400. Similar, like 394 could become maybe like a nice 420 or 430 rather than a full 440. And I know those like $10 gaps don't really play too much of a role if you're in the Apple community, where Apple asks you to pay like $200 more for 8 gigs of extra memory. Like in an era where like AMD has been so aggressive in pricing, and up until Zen 4, unfortunately, not after, those price differences can really define which like CPU manufacturer, which GPU manufacturer gains market share. What is interesting, of course, here is the Max Turbo. Now, granted, we do not expect those chips to always or even often hit Max Turbo. This is more for like productivity workflows. Like think of like rendering, but like instead of using the GPU like a sane person, you instead render with the CPU. But yeah, still 250 watts is a high peak considering that the number of cores is still the same. Of course, I've already talked about the reduced clock speeds. Of course, the less cores you have, the less cache you get. Nothing crazy here. We have some GPU cores, not too many, on the K SKUs and none on the KF SKU. So we're talking basically like the KF would be the same die as the K, but the GPU maybe had some issues, so that GPU gets disabled, which is even funny that we even get KF right now, because now that the GPU is on a separate die, like I don't even know how much sense that makes. Maybe they just even leave off the GPU die and just put in like a dummy die that still holds it all together. So that will be interesting to see in like proper breakdowns. And as I already mentioned, we do have an NPU. This is a last gen NPU. This is not the one matching the Lunar Lake performance, basically being like 3 times slower. But at 13 tops, it's not good enough for Copilot. So Copilot usage would be basically restricted based on what GPU you have. But that has been a mess in terms of launch. Like the thing that really effed my mind was like when Microsoft said like, oh yeah, all the Copilot Plus stuff available day one on the Snapdragon X Elite. And here's like AMD a Strix Point with technically an even faster neural engine or neural processing unit. And nope, no Copilot for you day one. We first optimized it seemingly for ARM and the specific NPU in the X Elite for some reason, but somehow our actual like good, well-selling CPU partner AMD, we didn't bother to optimize it for their architecture. That was when I really understood that Microsoft has no cohesive communication between like their laptop and like Surface tablet devices, that unit that makes it, broader Windows, all the optimization teams. It just feels like a 1,000 different people all working on one part of a giant puzzle, but everyone is capable of changing their mind mid-work. So of course the puzzle just turns into a schizophrenic mess.
Here's the table of specs. The biggest immediate change is the death of hyperthreading in this lineup. In order to boost single-thread performance and make up for clock speed loss, this new generation omits hyperthreading entirely. That makes total thread counts lower across the board and equal to the physical core count instead. More threads, more cores isn't always more better. It really just depends on the architecture, the speeds, and how the CPUs work. So all this is going to come down to actual testing and real-world use. The names are another big change and a somewhat confusing reset. So in a loss to hyphen and lowercase letter enthusiasts everywhere, Intel has dropped the dashes and the lowercase i's from the names. And genuinely, we probably need to explain some of this just to get everyone up to speed, because it's going to be coming up a lot.
Yeah.
The numeric part of the name is no longer 5 digits, now it's 3, and they get to be ultra now. So instead of i9 equals blank 900, i7 equals blank 700, and i5 equals an admittedly a little less clean blank 400, 500, and 600. Now,
but I wouldn't even mind that. Like I have always thought that like what would be clean in a way would be like i9 would be 900 and maybe like 850. 7 would be like 700 and 650, and 500 would be like 500, and i5 would be like 500 and 450. And imagine if I told you that, and I told you, well, 5 is 500 and 450, and you would be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like 450, you would still round up to 500, right? Just even like basic math wise, right? Imagine if I told you, well, no, it's only one of those two, and you would be like, okay, so it's only just the 500. Nope, now it's only just the 450. Like, this gen is so crazy that he'll explain it better than I do.
To be 9 equals 85,
yep.
7 equals 65, and 5 equals 45. So
And there is no reason for that. Like, I guess they want to maybe like reserve the 2900K, the 290K for like almost like an eventual KS model, so they could get rid of that as branding. But like you could have just given us 290K, 270K, 250K. It's so stupid.
There's probably an Orwellian 2 + 2 = 5 joke in here somewhere, or maybe a Jean-Luc Picard "There Are Four Lights" reference.
Great reference.
We're very cultured here. The $590 flagship Ultra 9 285K has 8 P cores, 16 E cores, and a total of 24 threads, again without SMT. Think of this like the 14900K replacement. The max core frequency is 5.7 gigahertz with a claimed maximum turbo power of 250 watts. Now this number is comparable to the 253 watt recommended PL setting of today's.
I always find this number very funny. Like the idea that like Intel couldn't even tell you that it was 250 watts on the previous generation, but no, it was 253 watts. That's just always like, it just made me smile. Relay, yes, Intel releases just in time for winter. Well, hold your horses. We're gonna talk about power consumption and heat generation.
CPUs, depending on which of any number of circular recommendations you want to follow, but the actual power consumption numbers will differ, and we'll just have to save that for testing. They do have some claims, though. The 285K flagship runs 36 megabytes of L3 cache. The 14900K previously had 36 megabytes of Intel's combined cache. The 285K's frequency maxes out at 5.7 gigahertz, which is lower than the 6 gigahertz maximum advertised frequency on the 14900K, or 5.8 gigahertz, depending on which situation it's in.
Yeah, and of course lower than the 6.2 gigahertz of the 14900KS. So technically versus the absolute flagship of last gen, it's an even bigger drop.
And max frequency, as always, is going to be in limited scenarios. For all core frequencies, all those numbers come down. Lower frequency doesn't necessarily mean lower performance, necessarily. It depends on the architecture underneath. In this instance, though, Intel is going to be fighting to regain what it's losing here. The mid-tier Ultra 7 265K is $394 with an IGP, or $380 without. The 265K has 8 P cores and 12 E cores, compared to the 14700K's 8 P core, 12 E core, and 28 thread configuration. So, same P and E core layout, but fewer total threads. Boost is listed at 5.5 gigahertz max and 250 watt max turbo against the 14700K's 5.6
My assumption is that we're just talking
boost.
like about trim die here. Like, I don't think good. Intel can always surprise me. I mean, Apple surprised me by making the A18 a separate die from the A18 Pro, but my suspicion would be that this is just a cut down die where either some E cores didn't work or the P cores cannot reach the same max clock speed. So this is just a standard binning here. Of course, giving you a lot more value, given that especially for gaming, basically everything you will need are the P cores. And for the rest of the OS, I struggle to see how most people would need more than 4 or maybe 6 E cores. So this is such an enthusiast like flagship in a way, given like what are you really doing with those extra E cores? I'm just inclined to say, like, anybody interested in this generation should probably consider the Ultra 7. And if you have a nice GPU, do you really need? You can save at least a little bit of money by going with the K F-SKU. Yeah, I wish though that like Ultra 5 would, if that was giving you like 5.4 gigahertz, that would be such an easy choice for so many people.
Tells Ultra 5 245.
But this one is most definitely a separate die though. Like, this is way too cut down to be still the same die.
5K and 245KF are priced at $294 and $309, both running at 6P 8E configurations at 5.2 gigahertz max advertised boost and 159 listed max turbo power. One totally new thing here for desktop is the inclusion of the Neural Processing Unit, or NPU, in desktop. This facilitates operations leveraged by AI workloads like matrix multiplication and convolution, and has vector engines for general tasks. Basically, the included NPU is for AI tasks, whatever Intel and its software partners decide that means this particular month.
I think this is where like a big, this is, I I understand his skepticism, and I actually think it's valid considering Windows, considering we get AI acceleration, but AI acceleration that isn't fast enough for all the Copilot plus PC stuff. What I really just want to like give a shout out to Apple is like I recently looked into like we had all this controversy of like, oh, scalable matrix extensions, like that just exist to give you artificially high Geekbench 6 results. And then when you actually look at it, Apple really bothered to actually then implement SME tasks and stuff like that, and of course AI accelerated tasks so much throughout the OS, even before we are now getting Apple Intelligence. It just is baffling to me that anybody would really attack them for like giving you new features that are all technically part of like ARM v9, especially ARM v9.2, and now we are getting the Dimensity 9400, and it's seemingly lacking most of that. At least it's lacking like Apple's hyper advanced 512-bit like SME acceleration, but yeah, it's just like I just think that this control that you have over your own OS, your own APIs, your own chips, of course, and then of course all the software, because don't forget, Apple's OS isn't just like it's a home screen for apps from third parties. People use Apple's Photos apps, Apple's Notes apps, Apple's Emails apps. Safari is the go-to browser on iOS and macOS. People even use Pages, Keynote, Numbers, and GarageBand and iMovie and Final Cut, of course, on Macs and stuff like that. The fact that Apple has this control is really a luxury that I wonder if one were to talk to like Microsoft people and ask them like, would you like this kind of control? Like, I think they would be frothing out of the mouth saying like, yeah, yes, please give us one chip architecture, one chip manufacturer, one chip gen max per year, and let us optimize just for it. Like every time, I think they would love it. But of course, that's not what they're getting.
Whatever it is, we're sure that stonks will go up.
Well,
for the
Intel
rest,
stonks
Intel
have
spent a significant
consistently
portion
gone
of its
down.
time focusing on power improvements.
Yeah,
so
and this
reduction
is
in
to
power
your
or more
point,
efficient
really.
utilization of the same power.
Will Wintel, or which if you guys are not too old to remember that was like a colloquial term for the deep cooperation between Microsoft and Intel when it comes to really maxing out Intel CPUs on Windows. That, of course, at the time when AMD really had some grandiose successes with generations like Bulldozer. So yeah, Intel was very, very much the default choice for everyone, including Microsoft, when it comes to optimizing their OS. And it now seems like now it's more parity, definitely, and now Microsoft is even looking at like some ARM chips to like broaden their portfolio, which of course is bad for any of the individual CPU makers, because now nobody is getting love from Daddy Satya in the way that Intel got back in the day when they had no competition. Major demo: Intel Lunar Lake has the CPU performance of base M2. Why are people so excited about it? It's very efficient by x86 standards. And given that its only reasonable competition is AMD, because the Snapdragon X Elite, my God, all those names, they're burning my head slowly. Because the X Elite is an ARM chip with a terrible GPU, it's basically useless for what's like the enthusiast might be interested in doing. Like, it will be terrible in gaming because of compatibility issues and the weak GPU. It will not be great for rendering or because of compatibility and slow GPU. It will not be that great for even for coding, because obviously then testing that code, especially if it's x86 focused, will not be like a very native test. It would happen through a translation layer. So yeah, in my opinion, people were excited for Lunar Lake, and let's be honest, Lunar Lake is a bit faster than M2. I would argue it's pretty much exactly between M2 and M3 for its highest end parts. maybe just so much closer to M3 than M2. But of course, once we go down the stack and the efficiency actually and the power consumption actually starts rivaling Apple's, now you're actually correct, Major Demo. Now we are actually looking at M2 like performance, basically at M2 level power consumption in an N3 focused chip, N3B built chip. So that's insane. Major Demo saying again, the M4 is heroically good jump. Apple really felt pressure. My problem with that perspective is it just goes against what we know of chip design. Chip design happens. Usually the chip that is coming out right now was almost complete in some ways like 2 or 3 years ago. And then basically a refinement process starts. There can be changes that in between that still drastically change performance. I'm not denying that. Of course, you can change the amount of cache you still give the chip. You can even port it maybe to a potentially newer node than you thought you might. So I'm not denying that maybe Apple felt some pressure, but they didn't feel pressure because of anything that launched this year. Anything that launched this year has no impact on M4. And you know why? How you can know that? Because M4 even came out before most other chips. It came out on the iPad Pro. It in many ways predates anything real from Zen 5. It definitely predates Lunar Lake. It definitely predates Arrow Lake.
We're going to have this whole section dedicated to that. We're, for our testing, going to be using our new efficiency testing suite that we ran with Zen 5 for that dedicated piece. You're going to see that again for these Intel CPUs because there's a lot of claims here, so we need a good amount of software to really look into it, but we'll come back to that. So to start with what they're saying, Intel's Robert Halleck, who used to be
Major Demo, I'm not denying that competition has helped Apple or has motivated Apple to push beyond, but I would also argue, think of the gap that M1 had versus the rest, and I'm not talking like the 80-watt CPUs, right, in laptops, certainly not talking about desktop, but think against what M1 and then even later M2 were competing against. We're talking like Tiger Lake bullshit or stuff where Intel wanted to put one performance core. So if anything, Apple might be reacting to competition, but let us not forget that first and foremost, this competition is reacting to Apple, like especially Lunar Lake with a 4+4 CPU core layout plus 8 GPU cores. It's basically a direct response to M1. And this is where what I said still kind of holds true, where the chips that we're getting now are kind of an end product of something that might have started 3-4 years ago.
Robert Halleck said this.
Arrow Lake basically cuts the power consumption in half compared to Raptor, in half.
And you know that's not an AI video and it's a genuine Intel one because all of the Intel watermarks, they were RGB. So the claim is big, cutting power in half from Raptor Lake.
Who cares? Like, are you thinking it might get stolen from you? What?
And its refresh would be a major move for Intel.
If it's official, who
One slide
cares?
claimed, quote, up to 58% lower package power in lightly threaded.
Yeah, but again, this is where this is a new architecture. It has more cache. It is on a brand new node. So yeah, that efficiency gain, while it looks very big, and you could argue that this is like a equal performance single core test almost, maybe dual core. So yeah, if you're asking why were people excited for Lunar Lake, imagine the battery life on a laptop, because obviously Lunar Lake and Arrow Lake are built on the same CPU design. Almost. There are some small differences to AVX support on their desktop chips. But imagine if you ever got 8 hours of now maybe you're getting 8 hours of Zoom calls after this kind of efficiency increase on Lunar Lake. Could you imagine what that meant for Raptor Lake? And Raptor Lake was even built on Meteor Lake. Sorry, Raptor Lake is the predecessor to Arrow Lake, but Meteor Lake is the predecessor to Lunar Lake, because that makes perfect sense, of course. But yeah, can you imagine like what terrible battery life you were coming from initially, if, like before you got a 58% reduction in power consumption? Like that's just insulting that such a gap is even possible, especially like we aren't even looking at like 2 or 3 year gaps, which, for example, when you look at GPUs, they are more like 2 year gap products to get a full new generation. We're looking at 1, maybe 1.5 year gaps, and still the last gen was so bad that they can essentially reduce power consumption by half. From the M1 days, there was no competition, but now there's caught in a lot of categories. Yes, but that's a good thing. Like I never wanted to Apple maintain an insane artificial lead with Apple Silicon, because nobody else was gonna bother to create interesting SoCs. I still think that once M4 comes out, we will see that Apple's supremacy is based on far more than just using newer nodes. We'll see just how good their CPU architecture is. I actually think that nothing will beat Apple in CPU performance this year. Maybe on like multi-threaded and something like that, of course, because if Intel Core Ultra 9 will not do it, then maybe like a Threadripper part from AMD will do so. But yeah, when it comes to single core performance, I just don't see anybody beating Apple this year. And we'll get to why later on, because obviously we've talked about the lack of hyperthreading, but that doesn't obviously impact single core performance. In fact, it might increase single core performance. But we saw the clock speed regression from like 6 gigahertz to 5.7. And when we actually look at that a little bit, guys, we have a few more people watching. We've been streaming for almost an hour. I just wanted to give you like a call out to do all the YouTube jazz, as I call it. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Comment live. I love interacting with you guys. Love getting your opinions. And of course, beyond all that, whenever you catch me live, you want to leave a small donation, do so with a super chat or a super sticker. It goes a long way to support this channel, or you can become a channel member right here on YouTube or support your over on Patreon. So when it comes to multi-core, we have already seen that actually the M4, the M3 Max matches that multi-core result thanks to its 12 performance and 4 efficiency cores. This is based out of 8 performance and 16 efficiency cores. This is of course a 6 gigahertz result to give you almost the same performance as M3 single core. So once we get some more concrete uplifts, because Intel will mention Geekbench 6, we can actually extrapolate from that and think, oh, how will that compare to M4?
Loads compared to Raptor Lake Refresh, which was working with Zoom for that particular workload. Intel also stated this.
At the end of the day, trading a little bit.
Okay, so Geekbench 6 actually, now we will also have, I believe, a prettier slide that isn't completely clustered over with Intel branding here. Yeah, so wait, what is the difference here between blue Intel Core and AMD 9950X? So it's 5% faster than the 14900K. Oh my God, that's actually super low. Oh my God, that's super duper low. I'm actually gonna be generous, and instead of 3080, I'm just gonna give 3100 in Geekbench and times 1.05. No, not 105. That's 3255. So, and of course, you guys know the results for M4 are beyond 3600, sometimes as high as 3900. So, yeah, we're looking at 20% plus advantages here for Apple in single core results. At the very worst, more like 10 or 15%, but that is optimistic for Intel here.
Of the energy and thermal density of Raptor in favor of a wider core allows this product to produce substantially better per core power and deliver upside performance.
Intel noted that its multi-threaded performance was improved over Raptor Lake thanks to changes in voltage and frequency behavior. It also said that because Raptor Lake, correctly stated, was bouncing off of either thermal or power limits in a lot of scenarios, the claim was that the superior power handling of Arrow Lake would provide a lot of the benefit that they get, and it would allow it to keep pulling and go faster, although Intel wasn't 100% clear on, in that context, what specifically go faster means. In this chart from Intel, the company claims that its power efficiency in Arrow Lake at 125 watts is, quote, the same score as Raptor Lake at 250 watts, emphasizing what they said was half the power, the same performance. This specific chart is for Cinebench multi-threaded. In another
Sorry, I just had to enable a purchase for my niece on her iPhone because I am like the family administrator for everything. So what they said was actually pretty cool here. This is something that I do not want to just completely side glance and ignore. So they're delivering same performance as the 4900K at half the power. That is, of course, given that most of us will probably never even be, as I said, completely maximizing the 4900K. The idea that we can get that peak but now at half performance. I still don't know why the 285K, like this is a very zoomed in graph. Like if they said it's 5% or 8% faster, there is no chance, like, you know what I mean? Like this graph should like look noticeably different. You see that it doesn't even start at 0 to be more precise. So I hate graphs like that. Apple gets a lot of flack when they use graphs like that. But at least the main statement about same performance at half the power, that's really, really cool. And this also goes to show that those extra 5-10% or whatever, they're really achieved similar to what we discussed with the Dimensity 9400 that gave you like 90% of its peak performance at basically 50% of the power consumption. This is where you get like really brute strength results. Like this difference from even like seemingly what would be like probably performance achievable at 5.5 gigahertz to push that up to 5.7 and give you those 5-8% uplifts. That seems like it's really, really hurting the entire like thing. And I almost wonder if a lot of people will not be just really well off slightly undervolting the chip, seeing at which like current and stuff like that they can get around maybe 5.6 gigahertz, so technically like an ever so slightly down clock, but then maybe really save like 30-40% the energy, and still give you like 95-97% of the maximum performance. That's quite insane. It also suggests that the high clock speeds on the E-cores really go completely outside of the like the good performance per watt range. It really goes into like, in my opinion, slightly absurd territory where the E-cores basically don't deserve the E in their branding whatsoever at those high performance levels.
Chart from Intel, the company claims that its power efficiency in Arrow Lake at 125 watts is, quote, the same score as Raptor Lake at 250 watts, emphasizing what they said was half the power, the same performance. This specific chart is for Cinebench multi-threaded. In another slide, Intel again stated the same. They said 58% lower power in lightly threaded work, which was in a Zoom call here, and the same performance at half the power in sustained multi-threaded work as compared to the 14th series CPUs. Getting into gaming, Intel also made a lot of claims about the performance per watt of the CPUs. We call this efficiency, and this is something we really looked at in the Zen 5 standalone benchmarking video. Again, we'll carry that into Arrow Lake. So Intel says it has wider and more efficient cores that, combined with digital linear voltage regulators for per core voltage control, improves performance.
Okay, we're looking at gaming. Obviously, some people will now shit on me and say like, look, you Apple fanboy, what business do you have criticizing anything on Windows when it comes to gaming? None of these games even have like Apple ports and stuff like that. This is a scientific discussion. I'm not denying that macOS is currently worse for gaming. So let me just say, this is an embarrassing slide by any means. Like the fact that you would ever show like such big drops even gen to gen is crazy. But I guess some kudos to Intel for at least showing us that. I guess it's better to show us that right now rather than deal with all the backlash that AMD has seen when they launched Zen 5 and it had like games where it underperformed Zen 4. Some games perform noticeably better, but I would argue those are probably exceptions that might just really vibe well with the architecture. And then we have games that even use like Intel's APO, which is basically like optimization on the mouse basic level. And you can see that on in that way, it still comes out basically a tie. So same frame rates as Raptor Lake R, but with up to 165 watts lower system power. So again, it's an efficiency argument, an argument that Intel really doesn't make that often, certainly not for desktop parts. So it's just a very, very fascinating thing. Like I could see even Apple doing something like that. Like let's say M4, because it had such a small gap to M3, was just on a newer node, but it wasn't actually faster, right? It was running at the same clock speeds, had about the same IPC, right? And Apple could have just said, look, it has the performance level of M3, but it drops power consumption by like 20%. That's how we can put it into a super thin 5.1 millimeter M4 iPad Pro. They didn't do that. They also boosted performance, sometimes by 20% in some ways, which is insane given that M3 came out just at the end of last year. But I could see Apple making that efficiency argument, especially for a highly mobile product. To see Intel do that for a desktop chip is really funny. Don't get me wrong, I like efficiency, but it's very interesting to see that happen at all.
Per watt in some games. The first party slide shows on-par performance with most games. Robert Halleck said this.
Aero represents a reset on our desktop roadmap to give us significant thermal and electrical runway headed into the future. That's performance headroom that we can grow into with future architectures, and that's one of the reasons why we've been on such a quest to re-architect these cores.
And I mean, technically, the successor to that, unless there will be like a refresh, I'm not actually quite sure how on schedule they are for making chips based on 18A, which now that they cancel 20A, like if they really put the next chip on like a GAFET node with backplane power delivery, there is a good chance that they could, just from a node perspective, even give you like whether it's higher clock speeds or significantly better efficiency, higher density that they can then utilize to further like give you more logic and increase IPC. So I actually understand what he's saying. He's basically saying, look, we're going with a wider chip here, might not be clocked as crazy high, but that means also it sits on a much more comfortable place in the power in the performance power curve. And it literally gives us extra space to create, as he said, electrical runways to power all of it, to more evenly distribute heat. And of course, to hopefully make less heat in general, making it easier to cool. So yeah, I understand what they mean here.
Example, total system power for Arrow Lake was down to 447 watts from 527 watts total system power.
Yeah, but this one is defined, of course, with most of the power consumption coming from the GPU. So all the power reduction here of 80 watts, that is basically the CPU. And yeah, it is system power, of course, because we are looking at the entire package. Maybe the motherboard is also slightly more efficient or something like that. But the main point is that because they're running about the same FPS number, now, of course, it's not too great to see the 285K delivering less frames per second than the 14900K, but because they give you about the same FPS level, we can assume that the GPU load is the same. Now, that's not always true. Some CPU generations have an easier way to communicating with the GPU, but let's assume all other things are equal. Then we are seeing just what I assume would be basically a halving of CPU power consumption.
power on the 14900K, while FPS was functionally the same, although technically reduced. The biggest gains included a drop in total system power of 136 watts in Age of Mythology. Now, that's total system power, so it's not just the CPU, and 79 watts in Assassin's Creed Mirage, and 165 watts in Space Marine 2.
Yeah, it of course depends on how high was the CPU power consumption to begin with in those tasks. And then again, maybe the motherboard helps, maybe the FPS go down even enough to also reduce the load on the GPU, of course. That would be a very weird thing to show off, to say like, oh, look, our chip can make the 4090 more efficient by giving it a worse CPU bottleneck. But usually the chip, which we have now obviously stated, can run it up to 250 watts, technically even higher with like spikes. Like usually gaming will probably be more like in the 150 watt range. So when you're looking at 165 watt reductions, it really boggles my mind to think, what was even the power consumption of the CPU here to begin with? Are we looking at the 4900K using 300 watts in Warhammer Space Marine? Like, really? Are we seeing it used like beyond 250 watts in Age of Mythology? Now, yeah, these games tend to use a lot of CPU, which a game like Black Myth Wukong is probably much more GPU limited. So it makes sense that probably the entire CPU ran at like 100 watts, maybe even less, and you get a 34. And then these power reductions do make roughly sense with all the other statements. But yeah, these reductions of 136 and 165, man. And I mean, they say system power, but it's not like, unless they drop literally performance here also by like 10% so that the GPU has a lower load, it's hard to imagine how that works.
The rest were in the 30 to 60 watt range for reductions. All right, now we got into some pretty interesting stuff. We're not gonna have as many images for this because they just don't have them ready for us yet. But this is an area where we really focus to try and learn more, and it's about the thermals, but also the socket change. So this might be unique information to our report. So first up, there's gonna be two retention mechanisms for Arrow Lake. The first one is the one that we all know from LGA 1700. Nothing has changed.
You know what? I don't think this is too interesting for us here. Basically, there will be two socket types with the one mechanism that's probably going to be a little bit more expensive in the way it applies pressure, but does so more evenly. There are better thermals that are being targeted here in general. It's supposedly easier to cool. Very basic stuff. For a chip that's supposedly more energy efficient and also wider and like redistributes like its electrical connections even a little bit more evenly, that all makes sense. But we guys here on this channel, we will not be building like Thermal Grizzly sponsored cases with the latest Intel chips. So I feel fine skipping that and jumping to 1512 to performance targets. 1512.
From Intel for gaming. We won't spend a ton of time here. That's what our own testing will be for later. But Intel had some slides relating to gaming performance and being what they say is the cooler gaming CPU. Now, cooler here is not specifically defined. We assume that means wearing sunglasses indoors.
Thanks, Steve.
The most interesting takeaway is that even in these first-party numbers, not many of the games favored the new 285K. A summary slide describes it as, quote, flagship gaming FPS and being at, quote, parity with the 14900K and 9950X.
To anybody who, of course, follows PC hardware, you know that AMD doesn't just have usually Intel's 8-core chips even outperform their 16-core chips when it comes to gaming because there's less scheduling issues. But also, of course, AMD has their X3D 3D V-cache parts, which add, of course, a lot more cache, therefore higher IPC, technically, if you want to see it that way. And it really helps with games. As we've talked a lot about on this channel, cache is basically bandwidth, and you can increase bandwidth by giving something a larger memory bus, faster memory, or you can give a chip a lot more cache. And this is what AMD does with 3D V-Cache. So, and soon they will be releasing like the 9950X 3D, which is very likely to be like 15% faster or so than the 9950X. So if you think that it's good enough for Intel to match the 4900K, ooh, yikes, I do have bad news for you.
Across a geo mean of 31 games. In some tests, we observed Intel's tiny footnote that it had APO enabled, which is not available on AMD.
And really skews like results artificially. It's also weird to even point that out, because I guess just for scientific accuracy, it might make sense mentioning it. But of course, APO is supported on the 4900K. So it's not a generational advantage nor a generational disadvantage, but it is technically an advantage over AMD. A very small one, but an advantage nonetheless.
The other main focuses for Intel this generation is IPC, where it claims a 9% average uplift for P cores and 32% or up to 72% average IPC gain for E-core IPC.
This is what we've also seen yesterday with the Dimensity 9400 breakdown. You can see that the newer architectures heavily favor floating point computations over integer computations. Ironically, kind of the opposite of what is happening with the neural processing units. But obviously, FP on a very basic level is more advanced, more complex than int. And this is why the focus is increasingly on better FP computation. And this is where Apple is somehow, with the way they handle their architecture, really far ahead of the curve, where Apple does have great FP compute, but their int isn't too far away. So Apple seemingly still keeping like int in their heart in that regard. I don't know whether that means that maybe down the road they will also start heavily favoring floating point compute versus integer, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. But yeah, it's very interesting to see the I guess the focus of these companies, and obviously as they target newer architectures, newer games, newer apps, they are trying to also optimize for newer computational paradigms. What do we have here? They skipped through those things really quickly. So this is probably the most important graph. And again, this graph does not start at 0. Or at least I would be very surprised if it did, because that doesn't look like 10% of this. So an up to 9% uplift over the previous generation. You can see some are slightly higher, few are lower. So they do not specify which tasks.
Uplift for P cores and 32%.
Okay, that's fun, I guess. But what's interesting to me here is Line Cove, yeah, Raptor Cove is, which is also like Line Cove is the CPU architecture of Arrow Lake and Lunar Lake. But Raptor Cove is the CPU architecture of Raptor Lake. So here the names were actually like matching each other, but here we have one name that neither fits the Raptor, unless you mean like meat-eating animal, nor Lunar Lake. And wait, it doesn't fit. Yeah, well, Raptor Lake would be the previous generation, so I guess that's how they evolve it with animals. But then Lion doesn't fit either Arrow nor Lunar Lake. So I'm just really confused by all of this. But yeah, main point that I was trying to make, 9% IPC uplift. Don't forget, we are seeing that 300 megahertz reduction, or let's say 5% reduction in top clock speeds. Let's ignore the existence of the 4900Ks for a moment. This would mean that on average, we should be getting somewhere between 4 and 5% more real performance. Now, this is specifically talking single core P core, because you can still change a lot with multi-threaded frequency, maybe like with the chip being so much more efficient, you can boost the clock speeds actually when utilizing all cores. Previously, the gap between single core boost frequency and like all core boost was pretty significant. Of course, the E cores are now both much higher IPC and higher clocked. So technically you could utilize them a lot for multi-threaded tasks much better. But yeah, when it comes to single core performance, primarily from the P core, because this is where your best single core will come from, that doesn't look too good, because less than 10% IPC uplift when you're getting a 5% reduction in clock speeds. Yikes, that doesn't look too good.
Focuses for Intel this generation is IPC, where it claims a 9% average uplift for P cores and 32% or up to 72% average IPC gain for E core IPC, depending on workload. All right, so now getting
Which
to
I
some
guess
of the
mean it just runs like the average is like 50% higher IPC for the E cores. But don't forget, the E cores last gen were pretty crap. At least when it comes to IPC, so that's yeah, that makes sense that they are boosting it.
Platform changes, the I/O, and all that stuff on the motherboard side as well. So starting with memory, Arrow Lake's making some changes here. They are now formalizing support for DDR5 6400 JEDEC standards, while the 13th and 14th gen could run at that RAM speed. This is now Intel pulling up the bar for what's more or less guaranteed out of the box. Single DIMMs can be up to 48 gigabytes with a total system capacity of 192 gigabytes, and ECC is supported. The emerging CUDA
Man, it really blows my mind that like with M4 Ultra, I'm not even sure. Maybe Apple can boost like memory support on M4 Max already over 128 gigabytes, which is the maximum on M3 Max. But even if they don't change it on M3 Max, that will on M4 Max, that will still make M4 Ultra a 256 gigabyte RAM chip at its highest configuration. And to me, given that this is, of course, unified memory that can benefit the CPU, the GPU, the neural engine, knowing that like NVIDIA is currently barely hoping to give you 32 gigs of RAM on the upcoming RTX 5090. And maybe down the road, they will use higher capacity DIMMs to like go from like 16 gigabytes on a 5080 to maybe like 24 gigabytes on a 5080 Ti, thanks to 3 gigabyte DDR7 modules. It's just this mind-blowing to think that if you actually want something that can have like, let's say 100 gigabytes, let's say you're firmly still below 128 gigabytes of memory for like a GPU intensive task, like a big render project that you're smartly running on the GPU, not the CPU. You're not a caveman. Or maybe you're running like one of those super huge large language models with the original database feeding into your chip. Like the fact that to even think of that, you would need like completely server class hardware. That is so insane on anything but Apple even. And then technically like Strix Halo would give you that. I believe Strix Halo is rumored to support up to 128 gigabytes. But then again, it's going to be an AMD based chip, so it's not going to have the same AI acceleration as NVIDIA. It's not going to have the same ray tracing performance as NVIDIA. I believe we have seen tests where the M2 like outperforms like AMD's technically ray tracing capable hardware. And if you guys know, of course, M2 was before the hardware accelerated actually came to M3. So the way Apple just utilized regular compute and M2 was apparently still better for things like 3D rendering than whatever AMD is pulling off with RT acceleration.
DIMM memory standard will be supported, which are modules with their own clock driver on board for a cleaner clock signal with less skew. That should help keep extreme speeds approaching DDR5 10,000 stable. Platform connectivity breaks down like this. There's a total of 48 PCIe lanes, 20 Gen 5 from the CPU and 24 Gen 4 from the 800 series chipset. The CPU itself can also host 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. Other capabilities of the chipset include 8 SATA ports, up to 32 USB 3.2 ports of various speeds, up to 14 USB 2 ports.
So obviously this doesn't really, like us in the Apple community, doesn't interest us too much. I still wonder, like, who are they building this for? like up to 32 USB 3.2s, up to 14 USB 2.0s. Like, I wonder just how much better that would be if this was just like if all of this shit, like those 46 USB extra connections possible, could technically be even just 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports. And of course, now that Thunderbolt 5 is technically possible, it's not a default implementation, not on the CPU itself and not on the motherboard chip, unfortunately, but it is possible and it is mentioned. It's weird to me to see like, oh, here you have like 50 USB ports. I'm like, what? And like nobody will even build motherboards with that many USB ports, so why bother?
2.0 ports, and we would really like to see that motherboard with dozens of USB options. The new tall rear I/O form factor for cases. Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3 come natively, but board vendors can implement discrete solutions for Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet LAN, and Thunderbolt 5. As always,
and this is where I am getting so angry with Intel. Like, I understand Thunderbolt 5 has existed at this point now for a while even, but it's this completely optional implementation that probably like requires like those like special Intel Thunderbolt controllers, where I'm like, bro, this is a brand new generation. It's your one chance to show off, and you refuse to give us Thunderbolt 5 by default? Like, at least those 2 like Thunderbolt 4 ports that are directly on the CPU, right? Make it one Thunderbolt 5 port for all I care, right? This is so weird. Like, you're Intel, you're designing the Thunderbolt standard. If you're not willing to actually keep improving it, then completely give it over to that freaking USB standards board. Like, because basically the upcoming USB 4 Gen 2 or something like that standard is basically Thunderbolt 5 anyway. But can we please get some Thunderbolt 5 hardware actually?
Tall rear I/O form factor for cases. Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3 come natively, but board vendors can implement discrete solutions for Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet LAN, and Thunderbolt 5. As always, board vendors can add their own third-party chips for even more than this. Intel briefly discussed overclocking features as well. Frequency steps for core clocks are reduced to 16.66 megahertz. This gives much more granularity of control versus previous Intel generations. Zen 5 also made improvements in this department recently. Intel gave an example of a workload where the max theoretical clock was 3.08 gigahertz. Intel's legacy clock controls would have the core cap out at 3.0, but now allow for 2% higher clocks in this specific example of 3.067 gigahertz. Other OC-related updates include dual base clock to run the SoC and cores separately, control over the interconnect fabric clock, a bypass of the CPU's internal voltage regulator, and allowing for increasingly higher overvolts as the CPU gets colder. The last one could be a little concerning if it does that automatically, obviously.
Yeah, this is where we are, I think, a little bit with all the like liquid nitrogen cooling that Geekervan does for their peak performance metrics on chips, where seemingly, yeah, they do overvolt and basically they might not even give you too much extra performance, but they basically give you better chip utilization in a very simple way. And I just, like, I would like to turn that off almost in my phone. Like, when it's running cool outside, I don't want my phone to run hotter and hope that it gets cooled by the outside. I would just like for it to run extra cool.
But maybe this will be interesting for XOC. We don't have much in the way for slides for this one, but Intel also verbally highlighted, or at least recognized, undervolting and the community that has emerged around that. So they talked about that.
But that community has emerged because like the 3900, the 4900, even the 700 series chips were a little bit of a hot mess.
At least a little bit. Now, architecturally,
I don't know how notable that community is, but I guess once it has already been built up, it's better to support it rather than spit in their faces.
Really quick information here. We went into most of this back at Computex when Intel gave some Lunar Lake details, some previews to its Battle Mage GPUs, or what will eventually become them. And we covered the Lion Cove P cores and the Skymont E cores in that previous piece. So just a quick recap here. It's been a while since then. Intel says that it made broad level changes to modernize its core IP design database, not changes the consumer will see right away, but should pave the way for future updates, they claim, and scalability.
This is the thing that makes me kind of most interested. I don't want to say excited because at this point I'm probably not really excited for any desktop Windows focused chip that I will probably never use myself. But the idea that the people themselves are saying, like, look, they're not using those words, but those are a little bit like, this is our Apple Silicon moment. We can build from this, right? You know, like how St. Peter said, on this hill I can build my church or whatever, right? Or how I infamously said that on the LTT drama that came up, I believe last summer, I could build my channel, and I guess I did. But that I guess gets me somewhat interested in knowing what's the future. I would also like to know what, of course, Intel A will mean for future Intel chips. Of course, there's more features in general, like all the AI stuff, the GPU itself becoming better, though I believe they don't utilize their latest generation GPU inside here. Not that it's even really needed, considering that people will use dedicated GPUs with such a powerful desktop chip. There are, of course, new media engines. Now AV1 is more important, so that will be interesting to see. I have said time and time again that I'm really interested in the M4 Pro and M4 Max chips, potentially maybe seeing some upgrades in them like we have seen in the past. For example, the M1 Pro and M1 Max introduced ProRes media engines. So the architectures are usually very, very similar, basically identical. But when you look at the entire die and all the IP blocks that you have there, media engines, storage controllers, memory controllers, there can be different implementations here. In fact, one thing that I have said I would love to see if for the M4 Pro and M4 Max to actually utilize faster memory than the base M4, because the base M4, we know, similar to the A18 and A18 Pro, utilizes 7,500 megatransfers per second memory of LPDDR5X. We, of course, know there's a lot faster LPDDR5X out there. There's 8533. There is 9600. There is 1066.7, which is now the latest LPDDR5X being utilized in the Dimensity 9400. And usually those newer LPDDR5X modules, now they will not use less energy because they're obviously like higher clocked, but they're still more energy efficient, which means usually if you're, even though you're running them at higher clock speeds, you will probably not consume too much more energy than like the 7500 LPDDR5X module, or even like an 8533 module. And of course, when you are not fully saturating your memory, now you actually get to recoup those efficiency advancements by potentially increasing battery life or lowering heat production, basic things like that. So if like Apple could use faster LPDDR5X on M4 Pro, M4 Max, that would be really, really cool, in my opinion. Infamously or famously, M1 Pro and M1 Max used faster memory than the base M1, with the main difference being, of course, that M1 Pro and M1 Max came out a full year after M1, while M4 Pro and M4 Max are launching like around half a year, even less, after the base M4. So take it all with a grain of salt.
Visible backend stuff like this isn't flashy. It's still important, though. Material changes to the P-Core design include AI-based power management, wider scheduling across both allocation, rename, and retire, a split out-of-order execution engine, separating vector and integer
Yeah, we've seen that time and time again now. Split out-of-order execution engines. I don't know whether or not they could ever result in the future when potential like security issues, similar how Spectre and Meltdown were like related to basically like predictive algorithms on the CPU, like what task might come next. Like again, in here we have literally 8x wider predict. So all that stuff, I don't know if that could result in like security issues that are basically built on into a hardware level, and the only way to mitigate that is to actually like get rid of some of that extra performance that is gained from it. But hopefully that doesn't happen. Of course, we know that some security issues persist, even like there are some Apple Silicon security issues that are still out there technically, but they usually require like direct access to a piece of hardware and stuff like that. So Apple would rather keep that security vulnerability, maybe fix it in some obvious way, not on a like deep root level, and instead just say like, look, don't get yourself into situations like that, and we won't kill your performance to compensate for that potential.
8 times wider prediction, and an enhanced memory subsystem with 3 megabytes of L2 cache per core. E-core updates are more drastic with 2 times the L2 cache bandwidth.
Yeah, and basically everyone who was like previously saying, oh, Apple is cheating with just how much cache they're using. Technically, I believe this chip for just CPU does have more cache than Apple's chips, and still it will come probably below what Apple is delivering. It probably will have higher multi-core performance than the M3 Max, definitely below the M4 Max at that point. And in terms of single core performance, it's 100% coming in below the M4.
4 megabytes shared L2 cache within each complex of 4 cores, deeper queuing, enhanced prediction to find instructions faster, and wider allocation to retire. Intel also claims that E-cores have 2 times the AI throughput from 4 times the 128-bit floating point and SIMD vector capability. And you can learn more about that in our Computex coverage for those 2 specific types of cores from June, or maybe it was late May previously. Physically, Arrow Lake differs from previous generations as well. So if you opened a lid on a CPU anytime recently for desktop, you would be greeted with a single large monolithic die.
It's interesting that in their presentation style, this is kind of apparently either the least important stuff, or it's so important that it's worth reserving it until the very end. I've basically already covered that.
You would see chiplets, so you might see 1 or 2 chiplets containing all the cores in the cache. I guess you could have vCache as well, and then a third for the I/O. So Arrow Lake is going the tiles approach to this, and that means the GPU, the SoC, the I/O, and the compute solution are all on separate pieces of silicon arranged along a filler tile on top of an interposer base tile. So in other words, there's a lot of glue on display here. That's weird. We thought Intel hated both glue and snake oil. But then again, Intel also said it left AMD in the rearview mirror 2 years ago, and that CUDA was a footnote in history before it became the domineering force. So the heavy users...
Yeah, Intel's track record over the last couple of years when it comes to statements in general, like even bullshit like saying, oh, we might go get Apple back to not necessarily buy like our chips, but like build Apple Silicon in our fabs. And it's like, yeah, maybe at some point, maybe not the main A or M series chips, but maybe like Intel 18A at some point could become a node for Apple's modems, or a node for Apple's H series chips that go into AirPods and stuff like that. That all is possible, but I just find it funny the way they're talking about it. Like there's so much undue confidence, and so much bashing of technology than they later implement themselves. It's funny.
CPU glue is maybe just another reminder that Intel should really focus on itself.
True.
That covers the basics for now. So we've got more coming up. It'll be benchmarks for the most part. And if you have any specific use of CPU glue...
So it's interesting that they didn't cover it, or maybe I missed it. So the SoC tile is based on TSMC's N3B node. That's the same node that has powered now Apple's A17 Pro and M3 generation of processors. The GPU tile is on N5P. So that's technically basically the exact node that the M2 chip is built on, and very similar to the node that the A16 chip is built on. So A15 M2 exact node, similar to A16 node. The IO tile is based on TSMC 6 nanometer node. This is basically a slightly refined N7P node, with N7P being the node of Apple's A13 processor inside the iPhone 11 generation, and the A13 chips. My God, once you try to align all those numbers, so there's a lot of different nodes. Basically, all compute stuff is handled. Oh, and both the IO tile and the wait, which tile? There were two tiles that were in 6 nanometer. Was it the filler tile? Actually have to look up. Error Lake 6 nanometer. I'm actually not sure what the other nodes are built, like the base tile is built on. My God, why? Intel Arrow Lake video cards, command 5 nanometer. Really? It's not in here? TSMC. Yeah, it takes you to the comments. That's crazy, chat. And yeah, of course, that's what gaming outlets are taking away from. That this is 5% faster. Command 5 nanometer. Really? Nothing? Did they not specify it to like everyone? Oh, here's the SoC and the IO tile. Okay. I always like the IO tile, and I guess the compute tile is the SoC tile is this. Oh, the compute tile is what they call the CPU tile. Okay. I guess I just mixed up the names. So this is the CPU tile. So actually, it makes sense that this is the biggest part in a way. Similar in size to the SoC tile, but the SoC tile, I believe, has some like of the accelerators and stuff like that. And the GPU tile has the GPU, and the IO tile has the memory controller and stuff like that. Yeah, now it makes sense. I got myself a little confused by ignoring that I didn't know, for some reason I thought compute tile was showing that, but of course that is the base tile. Yeah, interesting. So 3 nanometer, N3B, N6, N6, and N5P. So if you want to obviously evaluate the entire package, it cannot be by definition as sufficient, with everything else being equal, as Apple's completely N3E built chip. And of course, Apple's chip exists on one die. They don't need a base tile to communicate and stuff like that. But when we just look at the CPU, there is actually very little node advantage that Apple has by using N3E versus now N3B, because we of course know N3E might be like 5% more powerful and efficient, but it also is less dense. So you can technically treat it almost the same way as N3E. It's N3P that's actually going to be like a small but definitive uplift. But yeah, when it comes to stuff like obviously GPU efficiency, this is where Apple would pull farther ahead just based on the node that they're using. Of course, we do have to consider here, this is a CPU focused chip. The fact that there is a GPU in here basically exists to give you some integrated display output right away, and even then you can buy a KF SKU where I assume the GPU tile is replaced by like a dummy tile or something like that. Yeah, but that's about it. We've been streaming for about 1.5 hours. I believe this is now when most of my viewership is dying down, because now it's getting very late for all of you guys who are watching from like India and stuff like that. But thank you still so much for tuning in. This is now our second like impromptu video in a row at a slightly weird time of day. There is one thing that I would like to cover, not today, probably, unless it's happening right now. But I would actually create probably a new stream for that. And that is that Tesla has technically their robotaxi unveiled today. But I don't know if that's happening behind closed doors, if that's a real stream. It's really like bizarre what's happening with the robotaxi. I really think that this was just like an ego announcement from Elon to boost stock price, and it did. Stock prices for Tesla have increased by like 30% in like the last half year or so. But if they really under-deliver today, that all might go down the drain. So yeah, but I might cover that just tomorrow, because especially if the rumors are like, if the early announcements are all a little confusing, I really might need to dig deep and fully understand it. Or if it's just a complete nothing burger, I'm just going to skip it and stop giving this man-child extra attention. God knows he has enough of that. God knows he buys enough of that. God knows he manipulates enough of that thanks to his ownership of Twitter. Yeah, but I would be mildly interested to see how the robotaxi actually looks and what the promises for it are. I do have very low expectations here again, but for the stock price, I actually have high expectations, in the sense that this cannot underperform, or like the entire like Tesla pitch to investors will have been a complete lie, because their profit margins are gone, their incredible growth is gone, their ability to like bring pricing down, even to like recoup some of the profits, that's basically shot. Part of that is because the growth is gone, so they cannot really go into like benefits of scale anymore. And then their last point, their AI/FSD stuff, if that ends up underperforming, I could really see Tesla dropping by like 30 or 40% over a couple of weeks and months. If they really have to say, look, maybe by 2026 we'll have something ready. We cannot show you too much, but it will have the same basic cameras. That will not be enough, in my opinion, to convince actually like institutional investors. But yeah, that's definitely about it for today. Thank you so much for watching Gamers Nexus with me. Usually I do interrupt videos a lot more, but this is a very factual video, so of course I had nothing to correct and all to learn. So this is where my humility sprang in. So my task was basically to provide you like some Apple related context here, and I hope I did that. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, end the video with the YouTube jazz. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Whenever you catch me live, comment live. I love interacting with you, but also please consider leaving a comment once the video has been already uploaded. That helps a lot with the algorithm. You can support this channel with small donations as super chats or super stickers. You can become a channel member right here on YouTube, or a supporter over on Patreon. As always, let me know what you would like to see me cover next. Let me know if you are interested, for example, in the robo-taxi announcements that might or might not be coming. But it is the 10th of October, which is when that was promised. And they did give out some invites to press and stuff like that. So let's see. If something super interesting happens, I'll definitely let you know, and we'll cover it together as always. Thank you guys so much. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.